document was 2 pages long. Diane Hartley read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat in the car park of Sol Archer's office in Boona and stared through the windscreen at a gum tree she couldn't actually see. The property title had been transferred, 400 acres of Lockyer Valley land. The homestead, the dam, the south paddock her father had cleared with his own hands. All of it, gone from under her. Craig Hartley, sole owner, dated 6 days ago. This was the farm Diane had worked since she was 19. The farm she'd stayed for while Craig left for Brisbane and built a life that had nothing to do with red dirt and early mornings and cattle that needed feeding, regardless of what else was falling apart. She hadn't just managed this land, she'd given it her life, and her mother had been buried 3 hours ago. The wake was already underway back at the property. People would be arriving. There'd be food on the table and neighbors filling the veranda, and Craig standing among them with that quiet, grieving expression he'd been wearing for days. She didn't go back inside Sol's office. She didn't call her brother. Not yet. She needed to understand what she was holding before she said a single word to anyone. Because if this document was real, Craig hadn't just taken the farm. He'd been planning this while their mother was still breathing. She stayed in that car for 40 minutes. The engine was off. The Queensland heat was already building. Diane didn't notice either of those things. She went through the document a 3rd time, then a 4th. She checked the date on every page. She checked Craig's signature, his full name, printed neatly in the box provided. She checked the witness signature beside it. Sol Archer, the same Sol Archer whose office she was parked outside right now. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something she was missing. A clause, an amendment, something that made this less than what it looked like. Paperwork got confused. Estates were complicated. Their mother's affairs weren't simple. She'd just buried the woman this morning. She wasn't thinking clearly. That was it. She was grieving and exhausted and reading a legal document in a car park after a funeral. And of course she was getting it wrong. She pulled out her phone. She almost called Craig. She stopped herself, because somewhere underneath all the rationalizing, underneath the grief and the exhaustion and the desperate need for this to be a mistake, something was sitting very still and very cold. It told her not to call him yet. It told her to be sure first. She looked back at the document in her lap. Sol Archer had been Craig's friend since secondary school. She hadn't thought about that until right now. Diane had been 19 when her father first handed her the farm keys. Not Craig, not anyone else. Her. Her father had said she had the right kind of patience for it, the kind that didn't flinch. She'd taken that as the highest compliment of her life, and she'd never stopped trying to deserve it. That was 39 years ago. She'd been there through 2 droughts and 1 flood that took out the entire south fence line. She'd been there when cattle prices collapsed in the late 90s, and they'd had to sell half the herd just to keep the water running. She'd been there when her father died, when her mother sat at the kitchen table for 3 weeks and couldn't find a reason to stand up, and Diane had run everything alone without once asking for help or recognition or thanks. Craig had sent flowers when their father passed, from Brisbane. Wasn't bitterness. That was important to understand. Diane had never resented the arrangement. She loved the land the way some people love a person, completely and without conditions. She had chosen this life. She had chosen to stay, and her mother had always been clear, completely, consistently clear. The farm would be split. Equal shares, half for Diane, half for Craig. It had been the understanding for as long as Diane could remember. Her mother had said it at the kitchen table. She'd said it at Christmas dinners. She'd said it the week she updated her will 6 years ago with a solicitor in Ipswich who had absolutely nothing to do with Sol Archer. There had never been a single reason to doubt it. Not once, not ever, until now. 3 weeks before her mother died, Craig had shown up unannounced. Diane had been out checking the south paddock fence when his car pulled into the driveway. She'd come back to find him in the kitchen, sitting across from their mother with a bunch of supermarket flowers on the table between them and a cup of tea going cold in his hands. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Their mother was declining. It made sense that Craig would want to be present. It made sense that guilt, or love, or whatever version of it Craig was capable of, would eventually pull him back to Boona. After months of phone calls that lasted 4 minutes and visits that never quite happened, he stayed 4 days. He was attentive in a way Diane hadn't seen from him in years. He sat with their mother in the evenings. He took her to a medical appointment in Ipswich that Diane had been planning to handle herself. He'd offered before she had the chance. He fixed the hinge on the back screen door that had been loose since winter. Diane had felt something close to relief. She'd thought, finally, he's showing up. She'd even called her daughter that night and said Craig seemed different. Softer. Like the reality of losing their mother had finally landed on him properly. She'd been grateful, sitting in that car park now, document in her lap. She turned that memory over slowly. 4 days, unannounced, attentive in ways he'd never been before, and somewhere in those 4 days, her mother had signed something. She went back to the wake. There was no other choice. There were 60 people at the property, and her mother deserved better than an empty veranda. So Diane folded the document, put it in her handbag, and drove the 12 minutes back to the farm without the radio on. Craig was standing near the back steps when she arrived. He handed her a cup of tea like nothing had happened, like this was just a hard day they were getting through together. She waited until the last guests had gone. Then she put the document on the kitchen table between them. Craig looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He told her their mother had made her decision freely, that in her final weeks she'd had a clear sense of what she wanted and who she trusted to carry it forward. He said it calmly, like he'd rehearsed it. He told her their mother had felt that Diane had never really shared the farm, that she treated it as her own for so long that Craig had been made to feel like an outsider in his own family's property. That their mother had worried for years about saying something. Diane stared at him. He told her this wasn't about money. It was about what their mother had wanted, and that fighting it would mean dragging their mother's name through a legal process she never would have wanted. He picked up his tea. He told her to get some rest. Diane didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark in her childhood bedroom and tried to remember every conversation she'd ever had with her mother about the farm. Every single one, and for the first time in 39 years. She wondered if she'd been wrong about all of it, thought Kay. She was up before dawn, not because she'd slept and woken, because she'd never actually slept at all. By 5:30 she was in her mother's bedroom, not searching. Not yet, just sitting on the edge of the bed the way she had as a child, when the world had felt too large and her mother had made it smaller again, simply by being present. The room still smelled like her. Diane didn't plan to open the bedside drawer. She just did. There wasn't much in it. A rosary her mother hadn't used in years. A photograph of Diane's father standing in the south paddock, young and squinting into the sun. A folded electricity bill, and underneath all of it, a letter, white envelope, legal stationery. The return address was a firm she didn't recognize. Not the Ipswich solicitor her mother had used for years, someone else entirely. She opened it. It was dated 6 weeks ago, a single page referencing a consultation regarding title amendment and estate restructure, formal language, clinical. The kind of letter that meant something significant had already been decided before it was sent. She read the contact details at the bottom of the page. The correspondence address wasn't her mother's. It wasn't the farm. It wasn't even a Boona address. It was Craig's apartment in Brisbane. Diane read that line 3 times. Her mother hadn't initiated this. Her mother hadn't driven the process or chosen the solicitor or directed the correspondence. Craig had done all of it from Brisbane, and simply brought the paperwork to Buna when the time was right. She thought about the medical appointment he'd taken her mother to in Ipswich. She thought about the back screen door he'd fixed while Diane was out in the paddock. She thought about 4 days. Unannounced. Attentive, she put the letter down on the bedside table, next to her father's photograph. There was no version of this that was a misunderstanding. She called her daughter at 6:15 in the morning. Melissa answered on the second ring. She'd driven up from Brisbane the day before for the funeral and was staying at a friend's place in town. She heard her mother's voice and knew immediately it wasn't a social call. Diane told her about the document, the letter, Craig's Brisbane address in the contact field, the solicitor she'd never heard of, all of it. Melissa went very quiet on the other end. Then she told her mother to stop apologizing for noticing things. Because Diane had been apologizing, in between the facts, in between the details she was laying out clearly and carefully, she kept circling back to the same question, whether Craig had been right, whether she had been too present, too controlling, whether 39 years of dedication had somehow tipped into something her mother had resented, without ever saying so. She heard herself doing it and couldn't stop. Because that was the thing about what Craig had said the night before. It hadn't felt like an accusation. It had felt like something she almost recognized, like a version of herself she was afraid might be true. Had she given her mother room to breathe? Had she ever once asked what the farm meant to her, rather than what it meant to Diane? Melissa cut through it. She told her mother, plainly, that a woman who resented her daughter's presence did not spend 40 years asking that daughter to stay. She said grief was making her mother question things that didn't deserve questioning. And she said that a man who runs a state correspondence through his own Brisbane address while his mother is dying isn't acting out of love. He's acting out of a plan. Diane held the phone and looked out the bedroom window at the paddock, filling slowly with morning light. She'd been doubting herself since yesterday. She was done with that now. Melissa insisted on coming with her. Diane didn't argue. By 9 o'clock that morning, they were sitting across from a property lawyer named Ruth Callahan in a quiet office on Ruthven Street in Toowoomba. Diane had found her online the night before, someone with no connection to Buna, no connection to Craig, no connection to Saul Archer. She put the title transfer document on the desk. Then the letter from the unknown solicitor. She laid them out carefully, the way you present evidence rather than a problem. Ruth Callahan read both documents without speaking. Then she asked when Diane's mother had been admitted to Warwick Hospital for the last time. Diane told her. 6 weeks ago. She'd been there for 11 days before coming home for the final stretch, under palliative care. Ruth looked up from the documents. She told Diane that the title transfer had been lodged 4 days before her mother's death, that her mother had therefore been in palliative care at the time of signing. That combined with her age, her medical condition, and the fact that all correspondence had been routed to Craig's personal address rather than her mother's, there were serious questions about whether legal capacity had existed at the time the document was executed. Tata. She used the phrase undue influence. She said it carefully and deliberately, the way lawyers say things when they want you to understand the weight of the words without panicking. Diane felt Melissa's hand close around her wrist, under the table. Ruth told them not to touch anything at the property, not to move a single document, not to have any further conversations with Craig about the transfer until they'd spoken again. She said there was enough here to take further. She said that like it was reassuring. Diane wasn't reassured. She was thinking about Saul Archer, Craig's oldest friend, sitting across from her mother with a pen and a document, while Diane was 40 minutes away thinking her brother had finally come home to grieve. They drove back to Buna in near silence. Melissa took the wheel. Diane sat in the passenger seat with a notepad on her knee and wrote down everything Ruth Callahan had told them. Not because she'd forget. She wouldn't forget a single word of it, but because writing helped her think without spiraling. She needed to be methodical now. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. The first thing she did when they got back to the property was call the palliative care nurse, who had been visiting her mother in those final weeks. A woman named Jan who had been quietly, consistently kind throughout the whole of it. Jan didn't hesitate. She confirmed that Diane's mother had been on a significant sedation protocol for the last 3 weeks of her life. Pain management, entirely necessary, but the dosage, particularly in the afternoons and evenings, had been heavy enough that coherent conversation was often difficult. She said she'd be willing to provide a written statement. Diane thanked her and hung up before her voice gave out. The second call was to the Ipswich solicitor, the one her mother had used for years to maintain the original will. His records confirmed the existing will had never been formally amended through his office. The title transfer had been executed entirely outside of that established relationship, through Saul Archer's firm, which her mother had never previously used for anything. Diane wrote that down too. She and Melissa spent the rest of the afternoon going through the house carefully, not disturbing anything, just looking. In a kitchen drawer, they found a printed email, faint like it had been there a while, confirming an appointment at Saul Archer's office. The appointment was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Palliative care nurse's notes showed that Thursday is one of her mother's worst days. Craig had been in the house that morning. It was Melissa who found the note, tucked inside a gardening book on the shelf in the sitting room, the kind of place you'd only find something if you were looking slowly and carefully rather than searching. A folded piece of paper, her mother's personal stationery. The pale blue kind she'd used for letters her entire adult life. Melissa handed it to Diane without a word. It was short, 4 sentences, her mother's handwriting, or something close to it. It said she wanted Craig to have the land, that he deserved the chance to know it the way she had, that she hoped Diane would understand, that the farm needed someone who could start fresh with it. Diane sat down. For a long moment she didn't move, didn't speak, because this was her mother's handwriting on her mother's stationery, and the words were plain and clear, and suddenly the ground she'd been standing on felt like it was tilting. Maybe Craig had been telling the truth. Maybe their mother had felt this way and simply hadn't known how to say it. Maybe Diane had spent 39 years so certain of her place on this land that she'd stopped paying attention to what her mother actually wanted. She read it a second time, then she looked at the date written in the top right corner. It was the same date as the title transfer. She looked at the handwriting again, properly this time, not for the words, for the hand behind them. Her mother had been a precise, neat writer her entire life. Even in her 70s, her letters had been uniform and controlled. This was shaky, uneven. The pen had lifted mid-word twice. The signature at the bottom drifted below the line. This was the handwriting of someone who was heavily medicated, or someone who hadn't fully understood what they were being asked to write. The softness that had crept in, the doubt, the wavering, hardened into something else entirely. Ruth Callahan called on a Thursday morning, 4 days after their first meeting. Diane was out in the paddock when the phone rang. She walked back to the homestead slowly, not because she wasn't in a hurry, she was, but because she needed 30 seconds to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Ruth told her to sit down. She'd contacted Saul Archer's office requesting disclosure of all correspondence related to the title transfer, a standard step in the process. What came back wasn't standard at all. Buried inside the document bundle, likely included by an administrative oversight rather than intention, was an internal email chain between Saul Archer and Craig. Ruth read her the relevant section. In it, Saul had raised concerns, directly and in writing. He told Craig that their mother had seemed confused during the initial consultation, that she'd asked twice what she was signing, that she'd referred to Craig by their father's name at one point during the meeting. Saul had written that he wasn't comfortable proceeding without a formal capacity assessment from her GP. Diane stood very still in the kitchen. Craig's response had come back within the hour. He told Sol the family was aware of occasional confusion, that it was grief-related, not cognitive, that a formal assessment would cause unnecessary distress to a dying woman, and that there wasn't time. He told Sol, and Ruth read this part slowly and carefully, that he was confident in the decision and needed it executed before Diane became involved. Before Diane became involved. Ruth let that sit for a moment before continuing. Saul had dropped his objection. The document was executed 3 days later. Their mother had been alone in the room with Saul and Craig when she signed it. No independent witness, no GP present, no capacity assessment ever requested. Diane looked at the pale blue note still sitting on the kitchen table. Craig hadn't just taken the farm. He'd done it knowing full well that their mother didn't understand what she was signing. Ruth filed the formal capacity challenge that same afternoon. Within 48 hours, Craig had a solicitor of his own, a firm out of Brisbane with a corporate letterhead and a response that arrived by registered mail. It was 12 pages long. It used words like contested assertion and unsubstantiated claim, and it questioned Diane's motivations with a precision that suggested Craig had been preparing for this possibility for quite some time. He'd known she would fight it. He'd had the paperwork ready. Diane read all 12 pages at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening. Then she called Ruth and asked her to pull every financial record connected to the property going back 3 years. What came back changed the shape of everything. Craig had taken out a personal loan 18 months ago, substantial, secured against nothing, from a private lender in Brisbane. The repayment schedule was aggressive. He'd missed 2 installments. The third had been due the week he arrived unannounced in Boona, with supermarket flowers and 4 days of uncharacteristic attentiveness. The farm was valued at $2.3 million. Diane set the document down on the table. She'd spent the last 2 weeks thinking about betrayal in terms of family, in terms of a brother who had resented her, a mother who had been manipulated, a bond that had been quietly corroded over years. She'd been grieving the relationship as much as the land, but this wasn't about resentment. This had never been about resentment. Craig had needed the money. He'd done the arithmetic, and when the arithmetic pointed at the farm, at 400 acres and a dying mother and a sister who trusted him, he hadn't hesitated. He'd driven to Boona, fixed the screen door, made the tea, and executed a plan he'd almost certainly been building for months. She'd held her mother's hand while he did it. She sat at that kitchen table for a very long time without moving. She didn't cry about the money. That surprised her. She'd expected the financial documents to be the thing that finally broke her open. The loan, the arithmetic, the cold clinical proof that her brother had looked at their dying mother and seen a transaction. She'd expected rage. What she felt instead was quieter than that, and somehow worse. She kept coming back to a single image, herself sitting beside her mother's bed in those final days, talking to her, reading to her, playing the radio program her mother had listened to every afternoon for 30 years, believing, completely, without question, that Craig was somewhere in the house grieving in his own way. He hadn't been grieving. He'd been waiting. Melissa drove up from Brisbane that weekend without being asked. She found her mother sitting on the veranda in the dark and sat down beside her without speaking. They stayed like that for a long time. Diane told her she kept trying to locate the moment she should have known. The visit 3 weeks out. The medical appointment he'd offered to take. The screen door. The supermarket flower sitting on the kitchen table like a prop in a performance she hadn't realized she had a role in. She'd seen all of it. She just hadn't understood what she was seeing. And that was the part she couldn't shake. Not the betrayal itself. She understood that now with complete clarity. It was the trust that had made it possible. Her own trust. The absolute unexamined certainty that Craig was still her brother in the way that mattered. She'd handed him that certainty like a key. Melissa told her that wasn't a weakness. She told her that trusting your family while your mother is dying isn't a failure of judgment. Diane nodded. She heard the words. She wasn't sure she believed them yet, but she wrote them down anyway. The Supreme Court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in Brisbane. Diane drove down the night before and stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the courthouse. She didn't sleep particularly well. She lay in the dark running through everything Ruth had told her. The capacity evidence, the email chain, the loan documents, the timeline, and tried to trust that it was enough. It was enough. The court found that Rose Hartley had lacked testamentary capacity at the time of signing, that the circumstances surrounding the transfer, the routing of correspondence through Craig's personal address, the absence of an independent witness, the documented sedation protocol, and Saul Archer's own written concerns constituted clear evidence of undue influence. The title transfer was set aside. Craig was ordered to pay full legal costs, both sides. He didn't look at Diane when the ruling was read. He stared at the table in front of him with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not remorse exactly. Something more like the look of a man recalculating. Saul Archer had already been reported to the Queensland Law Society by the time the hearing concluded. A formal investigation was underway. Ruth told Diane the capacity email alone was likely sufficient to see his practicing certificate suspended. Then came the shift nobody had anticipated. A neighboring property owner, a cattle farmer named Des Whitmore who'd worked land adjacent to the Hartley farm for 20 years, contacted Ruth's office the week after the ruling. He had a conversation to report. Craig had approached him 8 months earlier, before their mother had entered her final decline, before the unannounced visit, before the supermarket flowers. He'd asked Des whether he'd be interested in purchasing a Hartley property. He described it as likely becoming available within the year. He'd asked Des to keep the conversation between them. Des had kept it. Until now. Diane drove back to Boona the morning after the ruling. She took the long way to Cunningham's Gap, down into the valley, past the town, and along the road she'd driven 10,000 times without thinking about it. The land opened up on either side the way it always did, wide and dry and indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 6 weeks. The farm looked the same. It always looked the same. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out. The south paddock fence needed attention along the eastern edge. The water trough near the dam had been running low for days. There was always something. There had always been something. She was glad of that. Craig had not contested the ruling. His Brisbane solicitor had sent a single paragraph acknowledging the court's decision and confirming he would not be pursuing an appeal. He had not called. He had not written. He had not appeared. She didn't know she would hear from him again. She found she could hold that uncertainty without it destroying her, which was itself a kind of answer about where she'd arrived. Saul Archer's practicing certificate was suspended pending the outcome of the Law Society investigation. The private lender in Brisbane had filed a separate civil action against Craig for the outstanding loan. Des Whitmore's statement had been forwarded to the court as supplementary material. It hadn't been necessary for the ruling, but it was on record now. What Craig had done was on record. All of it. The emails, the timeline, the loan, the conversation with Des, 8 months before their mother had even begun to decline. Diane got out of the car. She walked to the veranda and stood where her mother used to stand in the mornings, looking out across the paddocks toward the tree line her father had planted the year Diane was born. 61 years of family land. In the end, it had taken a courtroom to say what her mother never got the chance to. She went inside and put the kettle on. The farm was still here. So was she. Some things, it turns out, can't be signed away